Vermont's State Hospital committed more than 1,000 people to its wards, and its own superintendent was handing their files to a man building lists of who should never have children. This was not Nazi Germany. This was Waterbury, Vermont, and the program ran for 30 years. The building is still standing. State workers park there now. Vermont built its identity on independence and clean conscience. So who decided, officially, legally, surgically, which Vermont families were allowed to continue? To find the answer, we have to go back to before the hospital became a weapon, to the man who first picked it up. Burlington, Vermont, 1918. A UVM zoology professor named Henry Farnham Perkins reads a U.S. Army report on the state's draft recruits. The finding: Vermont men have an unusually high rate of defects, epilepsy, mental deficiency, diabetes. Perkins does not see sick men, he sees bad bloodlines, and he decides Vermont has a genetic emergency that a man of science is obligated to fix. 7 years later, Perkins founds the Eugenics Survey of Vermont, officially a private academic organization, funded in part by Rockefeller money. But here's the fact that changes everything. The 1925 Advisory Committee included the Governor of Vermont, the president of UVM, the heads of every major state institution, and the superintendent of the Vermont State Hospital in Waterbury, a physician named Dr. Eugene A. Stanley. This was not a fringe operation running beneath the state's notice. This was Vermont's consensus in one room on day one. Perkins hired a field worker named Harriett Abbott. Her assignment: go to the state's institutions, open the files, build pedigree charts of Vermont's so-called degenerate families. Abbott went to Waterbury. Dr. Stanley let her in. He handed over records of committed patients, their family histories, their diagnoses, the names of their relatives still living outside those walls. Abbott sat down at a desk and began drawing family trees designed to prove that certain Vermonters should not be allowed to reproduce. Waterbury was the largest hospital. Stanley had the most records, and Stanley, by every account that survives, was one of the program's most enthusiastic institutional partners. The question Abbott was building toward: who exactly were these families? Vermont's official position in 1925 was straightforward. There were no Indians left in the state. The Abenaki, who had lived in Vermont for thousands of years, who had survived King Philip's War and the French and Indian Wars and the long pressure of colonial settlement, were, according to the state, simply gone. Except they weren't. They were on Lake Champlain, living on houseboats. They were in the hills, selling handmade baskets at farmhouse doors, speaking a blended language, hiding what they were from authorities who had spent generations treating Indianness as a liability. Abbott's field notes told a different story. Her categories: families of French, Canadian, Indian, and Negro, mixed ancestry. Her code names in state documents: pirates, for the houseboat families on the lake; gypsies, for the basket makers moving through the hills. The state officially denied these people existed. The state simultaneously built targeting lists from their families. Vermont erased the Abenaki on paper. Then it began working on something more permanent. 1927. Dr. Eugene A. Stanley leaves the Waterbury Hospital and travels to Montpelier. He walks into the Vermont State Legislature and testifies in favor of a bill authorizing the sterilization of people held in Vermont state institutions. The bill fails. Stanley goes back to Waterbury. He unlocks the files. 1931. Stanley returns to Montpelier and testifies again. This time the legislature passes it. A law for human betterment by voluntary sterilization. Governor John E. Weeks signs it. Note the word voluntary. It applied to people committed to a state institution with no legal recourse, no due process, no independent advocate. Abenaki families sent to Windsor State Prison and to Waterbury without habeas corpus. Voluntary. The primary surgical site was the Brandon Training School. Vermont State Hospital at Waterbury was the commitment destination, the records depot, the machine that fed the program, and a secondary surgical site. Over 37 years, the program sterilized at least 253 people. The disproportionate burden fell on Abenaki families, on poor rural Vermonters, on anyone the survey had labeled a social problem. Some of them are buried in the cemetery adjacent to the VSH campus. The graves are still unmarked. In 1980, a judge finally ruled the 1931 law unconstitutional. Vermont's response was not to abolish the power. It was to rewrite the law, strip out the eugenic language, and keep the mechanism intact. The scaffolding survived the science that built it. And the man who designed the original program, Henry Farnham Perkins, UVM professor of zoology, former president of the American Eugenics Society, was already dead. He died in 1956. His daughters burned his personal correspondence afterward. Whatever Perkins wrote privately about who he targeted, what he believed, what he knew, gone. A family looked at those letters and made a choice. The official records survived. The family papers didn't. 2003, 2 patients at Vermont State Hospital commit suicide. Federal officials pull Medicare and Medicaid funding, more than $10 million a year. The U.S. Department of Justice opens a civil rights investigation of the same institution, the same address, a new generation. The DOJ findings letter, dated July 5, 2005, was specific. Conditions at Vermont State Hospital substantially departed from generally accepted standards of care, violating patients' constitutional and federal statutory rights. Conditions described as prison-like. A federal settlement followed in 2006. Same building, same pattern of harm, different letterhead. Also in 2006, Vermont granted its first state recognition to Abenaki bands, the people the state had spent decades denying existed, targeted under code names, committed without due process, sterilized, recognized finally by the same institution whose predecessors ran the program. The recognition arrived less than 50 years after the last documented sterilizations. October 2021. The Vermont General Assembly passes Joint Resolution R-114, a formal unanimous apology for the eugenics program and the 1931 sterilization law. The following year, Governor Phil Scott signs Act 128, establishing Vermont's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, tasked with investigating the full scope of what the state did and to whom. The commission was still active in 2024, and Abenaki councils have said publicly that the commission is founded on a myth, that the state has still not honestly confronted what happened, who was targeted, or why the official record was built to make the targeting invisible. Vermont said sorry. Vermont has not yet decided what actually happened. The building at 103 South Main Street is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. The state preserves it. Employees arrive in the morning and leave in the afternoon. The files Harriett Abbott carried out of this building in the 1920s, the pedigree charts, the case notes, the ESV records, are held in the Vermont Public Records Division, accessible, with names in them. The 1980 replacement law, the one without the eugenic language, the one that kept the power, is still on the books. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission is still meeting. And the cemetery is still adjacent to the parking lot, the graves still unmarked. The question that Perkins's burned letters cannot answer, and that Stanley never had to face, still open. What does it actually take to finish this? This one is from our own backyard. And it took us a long time to understand why the building was still there and nobody was talking about it. If you want to follow the Abenaki thread further, the next story lives about 40 miles south of here. Same war, different weapon,